So today what I'm going to do is show a few tips and tricks on how to make your soft toys come out a lot more professional, and it does have a result that you're much more pleased with when you're making soft toys. So a couple of my biggest tips when it comes to making toys is to do with the tools that you're using. So the first thing is with stuffing. Unfortunately, all stuffings weren't created equal, and you're really going to get a very different result depending on what stuffing you use when you're making your toys. So I've got some of my stuffing from home here. Unfortunately, being from Australia, I can't tell you the brand or where to get it here because you can't. But what I can teach you is a tip to figure out how to know whether your stuffing is a good stuffing or a bad stuffing. So grab your stuffing that you're using, or at your local shop, ask if you could try a little bit. Grab a piece of your stuffing, and what you just do is roll it around in your hands like you're rolling a ball of Play-Doh. And as you can see, I've been doing that for a while, and you can see this stuffing has kept a nice organic shape. It hasn't created a ball or a clump. It's sort of staying how it was, and it's still filling out into all the different areas. If you were to do that with your stuffing and it would start feeling ball-like, or even just feel like the outside fibres were creating a bit of a skin to that stuffing, that's not a good stuffing. So what that one will do is it will cause little balls or clumps within your toy. It's going to give you that, I like to call it, cellulite look to your toy, which nobody wants. So that's a good way to test your stuffing, just to make sure you're using a quality product. And the second, I think, crucial tool is your stuffing tool. Now this is the cheapest, easiest stuffing tool you're going to find. What it just is it's a standard school paintbrush. So make sure it's got a round end. In Australia you get these for about $1 or $2 at your local craft shop. So you grab your brush, and what you're going to do is you're going to trim the bristles so that they're about between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. So give it a good trim. Okay. And once you've trimmed them off, we're just going to messy up those bristles as much as we can. So on a hard surface, just muck them up as much as you can. You have to do the things you always got in trouble for as a kid. Mess up the paintbrush till it gets nice and shaggy. So you'll see there now that that's all nice and shaggy. So what that does, this is now the most amazing stuffing tool you've ever had. Use the smooth end to turn out my pieces and the scruffy end to do my stuffing. A lot of people are using chopsticks or knitting needles or soft items to stuff their toys. And you can kind of see by when I use the smooth end of this that it just slides. Any smooth object is just going to slide through or past your stuffing. The beauty with the rough end is, in opposition, it straight away grips onto your stuffing. So that just gives you a lot more control as you're stuffing your toy to get the stuffing to exactly where you want it to go. So I've got a little magoo here that's half made, so I can demonstrate the stuffing to you. So technique with stuffing, it's one of those things that, like any sewing project, you get better at it as you go along. So practice makes perfect, and like anything, probably your first attempt's not going to be your best attempt. But just keep practicing and you'll get the knack down. So when I'm stuffing a toy, what I like to do is always stuff to the very ends first and only move on in my toy once the ends are nicely stuffed. So with this magoo here, I'm going to get the stuffing right down to the ends. Now I like to use, I like to stuff really firmly. So I like my toys, you can probably see, looking up at these guys up here, I like to stuff them really firmly. I think that's just to get a more professional look. It doesn't really matter, but when using cotton fabrics or quilting cottons, you do tend to get a much nicer result if you stuff nice and firmly, because it fills out all those little creases and crevices. Sometimes if you're using plush or something softer, obviously you can be a little bit lighter. So while I'm stuffing this, because I'll show you a little bit what I'm doing with the stuffing in a minute, but while I'm doing that, I also have two other really essential things to let you know about when you're making a toy. And one is the thread that you use. So we all are used to using cotton when we make our quilts and when we're sewing generally. But with toy making, it is really essential that you always use polyester thread. Polyester thread is a lot stronger, so you're basically not going to get, or got a lot less risk of breaking your seams. recently I was teaching a class, and unfortunately when I got there, the sewing machines had already been set up all with cotton, and it was a bit of a disaster because I had a group of 20 people making a toy, and once we got to stuffing stage, people had their seams splitting as they were stuffing. So it really is a really important thing. There's nothing more annoying than getting to that final stage of your toy and then your seam splitting as you're stuffing it. You've got to unstuff everything, put it back inside out, try and sew it back up again. The other part of that is to use a really small stitch on your sewing machine. So I recommend about a 1.5 stitch length. You can go as low as a 1, it just depends what your machine handles, but I always use a 1.5. If you do that, you can stuff as firmly as I do. You're just not at any risk of those seams breaking, so that's really great. Now I'm going to keep going with this. This is the bit that gets a little bit boring, but until I get to the final stages of this being stuffed, I can't show you all the other steps. But I can show you as I'm going here that as I stuff, I tend to kind of think of it as like plastic surgery. It's really sad. I have these silly ways of thinking of things as I'm working alone at home, but I always think of it as being, you know how they do, they get the little bits of fat out and they deposit to the different little areas to fill out all the areas, and that's what I imagine myself doing as I'm stuffing, which is really sad, I know. But as you're going, you can almost see here how on the sides of my little guy's head there's a few sort of wrinkles and creases. So what I always just do is really support with my hand, but push those pieces right, up to those areas. And you'll see how straight away that edge already is looking a lot smoother there. And as I go, I can just kind of keep moving the stuffing into all those little crevices and make sure they fill up nicely. Once you get to a section like his body, you can be a little bit less fussy. It's just got straight sides, and so it's a lot easier to just stuff in big pieces of stuffing. You can also stuff those body bits a little bit looser if you want the toy to be cuddly for children, because it doesn't have those curves and crevices. You're not so concerned about filling out any creases or puckers. So I'll just quickly finish stuffing his body lightly, so then we can shut the turning gap. So obviously when making toys with your turning gap, you like to keep it somewhere that is as less obvious as possible within the toy. But obviously with a lot of toys, you can't avoid a turning gap being present, such as with this little fellow here. You can see his turning gap's there at his tummy. So it's one of the least obvious places on him, but still obviously you can see it if you look at his tummy. So the next thing I'm going to show you is how to do a nice neat closure, so that you don't have overlap of fabric or any puckering or bits and pieces. But as you can see now, we've got between his legs, it's a little bit rude, he's got his turning gap there. Now you can kind of see how when we've sewn with a 1/4 inch seam, usually your turning gap kind of retains that turned under 1/4 inch because it's got the 1/4 inch seam on either side, which is really handy when you're sewing together. But if you did have raw edges showing, just sort of slip them under with your finger and finger press so that you've still got that nice 1/4 inch seam allowance there at your turning gap. Now again, using our polyester thread, we get a nice length of it. Now I like to start with a knotless start. This gives us obviously a neater finish, but also I'm going to show you a little trick that is really basic but gives us a nice anchor. So get a length of your polyester, thread, fold it in half, and I'm actually going to thread the loose ends and keep my loop there. So what I'm going to do is start my stitching with actually a slip knot. It's really a very basic thing, but a really great thing when doing making toys. So I'm just going to take my first stitch from one side to the other, just a small one near the edge there. So I'm going to pull my thread, and then I'm going to put my needle through that looped end. Whoop.
That's genius.
So now we've got a nice slip knot there. So this thread's not going to pull through, especially if you've stuffed really tautly. You're not going to have a problem with that not pulling through. So then what I'm going to do is actually ladder stitch this closed. So this is a stitch that's often used in surgery by surgeons because it gives you a nice, neat closure. So what we're going to do, so you might need to get in a little bit closer to see this, but on one side of our gap, I will say I'm not used to sewing standing up, so you have to bear with me looking a bit wonky. We're just going to take one little running stitch through one side. Okay, and then you're going to sort of see where that comes out to the other side. And we're going to take another little running stitch along that edge. Again, see where that comes out, where it's meeting on the other side. And roughly there, I'm going to take another little running stitch. I'll wait till I've done a few till I pull it so you can see how nicely it comes together. But we're just going to keep taking running stitches. And you can see why it's called ladder stitches, creating like the rungs of a ladder there along where we're going. So I'll keep taking a few more. And once I've taken, I usually do about every perhaps half inch or so, I'll give it a good pull. So you pull it and you'll see how those edges just come together quite nicely. It's not fully tight yet, I'll keep going. So about every half inch. We pull that in. So you can obviously do it with a slip stitch, but with a slip stitch you often find that the edges kind of bunch up together and create a little bit of a ridge, or obviously the stitches can be quite visible. So again, I'm just going to pull that and you'll see how it's just coming together nicely there. At this stage, I've got still a tiny little bit of a gap left there. Now, depending on what sort of toy you're creating, especially if it's a fat toy, when you've just started sewing together your turning gap, you might find that it's not too bad with this one, but you have a little bit of a dimple. So what you just do is sew your turning gap as far as you can. You've still got a little bit of a gap left there. I've got maybe 1/4 inch of a gap left there. And if you need to, either you can leave a bit of a bigger gap so you can use your toothbrush tool, but I also use a wooden skewer as my other little tool for small bits. Again, we can still ease some bits of stuffing through that gap, she says, and go back to where I've been stitching and just ease that in to fill that gap. As I said, it wasn't really necessary with this toy, but you do often find with toys that you get that dip. So just keep, as you're sewing across, as you're closing it, just keep filling in little bits to fill that gap, especially if it's in a really obvious section of your toy. So once we get to the very end, again, we don't want a knot sitting on the outside of our toy. So we've avoided the first knot with that nice little slip knot. Then when we get to the end, we're going to do a technique which is quite normal for anyone who does hand quilting. We're just going to sink the knot within the toy. So what I do is create probably a double knot right close to where I finished my last stitch. So a nice little double knot there, really close to the toy. And then I'm just going to take one more stitch into the other side of the toy and bring it out somewhere that's fairly, it doesn't really matter, but a little bit of a distance away from where you've gone in and somewhere that you don't think is going to be as visible on the toy. And then you probably didn't hear that quick, but I just did a little tug with my thread there, and that knot is sunk into the toy. Okay. If you're making this toy for a really small child and you're a little bit concerned about making sure it's extra tight, sorted out, what you can do is you can keep this whole length of thread that you've got left, just keep sinking it in. Just keep taking another stitch over there. I've just lost my needle, but just keep taking it through, and you're just kind of sinking that whole length of thread within your toy, just reducing the chances that that's going to come loose. You can continue to tie little knots and sink them as well as you go along. And then you just trim the thread right at your toy. It's gone. Disappeared. Okay, so there's my little Magoo in the making.